Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Development Research and Practice, the course. We'll start in just a minute. I see a lot of folks are still joining, so we'll give a minute for everyone to connect and then get started with today's session. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So this is week 4, which we cover chapter 4 of Development Research and Practice, Acquiring Development Data. This chapter focuses on data acquisition of all types, whether it's primary data or secondary data, data that's publicly available, data that's privately accessed. And the focus in this chapter is on clear and careful documentation of data acquisition, which is essential for high quality research. So we focus throughout on how to maintain quality as you acquire data. And the first question to ask as we think through the workflow in this chapter is, do the data that you need already exist, or do you need to generate them? So this immediately follows, data acquisition immediately follows all of the design issues that we discussed last week from chapter 3, identifying what your data needs are for the project and creating your data map. Once you've figured out what type of data that you'll need in order to complete your research, then it's time to figure out how to get access to that data. And the first question is whether the data already exist. So if they already exist, then there's a workflow where you need to establish your right to access and use them. And typically this is going to involve a data license agreement. If the data do not yet exist, then you're going to need to prepare to generate them using electronic survey instruments, or at least we recommend using electronic survey instruments. So we'll talk through both of those workflows with a little bit of extra time and attention to the second, which is collecting primary data, as there's a lot more researcher involvement in the process and opportunities to influence both the nature and format of the data as well as the quality of it. And in both cases, you need to think about whether the data that you have acquired is identifying or if the access to that data needs to be restricted. Because if there's any elements of that data that are identifying or require restricted access, then you'll need to handle it carefully in order to ensure that respondent privacy is guaranteed, or that you're meeting the access criteria established in your usage rights. And so we'll talk specifically in the third section about how to safely handle that data. So as we jump into to the topics in this book, in this chapter, I wanted to first get a sense from the audience of what are the types of development data that you're primarily working with. And you can answer this multiple times. We want to know whether you're working more with primary data, publicly available data, data acquired from partners that might be only privately accessible, other types of data, or whether you're not currently working with any data and just attending the course to learn for the future. As I said, this chapter applies to all types of data, but we will dive in depth a bit more on the question of primary data. And I do notice a few people raising their hands. Please do note that we won't be using that feature, but you can put any questions into the Q&A box and we'll answer them there as this presentation is ongoing. Or we'll also have time for an open Q&A at the end of the session where any questions that you put in, I'll answer. But the rest of the team is here and we'll answer questions as they come up if that applies, or save them for the Q&A. We'll give another 20 seconds or so to put in our answers to this question. But so for now, I see that there's a lot of people working with primary data or publicly available data, and fewer that are working with data that's acquired from partners. So data that is specifically acquired for this research project and may not have been used by others before. So the first section of this handbook covers how to establish your usage and access rights to the data. And that's going to differ by the types of data that are available, which is why we want to establish this. But I see that enough folks are working with different types. We'll talk about all three. I'm going to close this poll now and go on to our next one, which is a related question of, do you have a documented right to access and use each data source that's required for your project? So if you're working on an ongoing research study, have you been able to establish the usage rights for all of your data? And that it maybe it'll be that you don't know. It may be that you have usage rights established for all data sources, maybe some, but not all, and maybe none. It'll depend a little bit on what phase you are at in your study, but also what type of data you're using and how you've gone about acquiring it. Give a few more seconds here for some last responses. Looks like quite a mix, which is what I would expect. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in this part of the lecture. And I'm happy to answer questions as well in the Q&A. Okay, let's move on. So the first question is around, how do you determine data ownership? What does that mean? And I saw a lot of people answering that, they weren't sure whether they had those that correctly determined for their data sources, or they might have for some, but not all. So I think this is worth talking about a bit. So there's a few different scenarios here. The first is if the data are publicly available. In this case, it can be very simple to determine your access and usage rights to the data. There's typically terms of use that are associated with them in whatever platform you're using to download. For example, a lot of DIMES data goes on microdata.worldbank.org, and there's specific license terms when you want to access and download those data that you have to follow. So that's quite straightforward. If the data are from a private source and not publicly available otherwise, then typically you need to establish a legal agreement with the partner organization that's providing the data. This most often takes the format of a data license agreement. And in this chapter, we talk in some detail about what data license agreements should include and provide some examples of terms and license considerations that you might want to think through when establishing those. But typically it's best to follow an established template or format for that agreement and modify it as needed for your particular case. And now the third case is if the data will be generated for the study. Now this may seem like the most straightforward, but it isn't always. So if you are collecting data specifically for this research study, there's often multiple parties involved. It could be that the research team is financing the data collection, but a local firm is actually doing the data collection, or that there's a government entity involved, for example, a particular ministry within a country that's involved in the data collection. So it's really important to clarify up front who will own and access that data and when that access will be granted, and whether or not they'll have access to the full data set or only partial access to the data set. And in creating the contract for the data collection, it's really important to specify the research team's intellectual property rights, that the research team will have the right to use that data and analyze the data and publish all outputs from that. So again, sort of assume that would be the case, but it's important to specify that and make it explicit in a contractual arrangement. So talking a little bit more about data licenses, here's an example from the World Bank and the template that we use. And you can see that there's a lot of possible categories, right, that one can establish for use of data. And it's going to depend on the nature of the data itself. Is it very confidential? Is it highly, sensitive or identifying? And in those cases, you want to kind of move more to the right on this continuum to the restricted access. where you might restrict access to, specific individuals or specific units, for example, within the bank. And on the other hand, there's data that might be, if we move all the way to the other extreme, data that can be made completely open and public. And so in that case, you'd want to be able to publish all of the data and not limit access at all. So it will really depend on the nature of the data, where in that continuum you fall. And it's important to establish that both the research team and the data provider agree on those terms. And then you're also going to be thinking within the data license agreement about, exactly what data you're receiving, how you intend to use it, how long you'll retain it, and especially that's true for any identifying portions of the data, who will have access to it, and who has rights to any of the derivative products from that. So data sets, metadata, research outputs, papers, who has control over any of those outputs, and how should the data be cited if you're able to publish it going ahead. Now, when you're acquiring data from research partners, it's really important to document everything that you can about that data. The examples of documentation you might want could include a data dictionary, manuals for how the administrative data system operates, reports or procedures for how the data was generated or collected, survey instruments and protocols if those apply, interview notes, basically any data that you don't collect yourself, you want to know as much as possible about from the data provider. And when you're accessing and acquiring all that data, that's the right time to get all of these supplementary materials, read through them, and prepare a README that documents all of your files that you've received with brief descriptions. It's often quite complex how data can be generated, and understanding that really well is going to be important as you go forward. And it becomes harder and harder to ask questions about the data generation process as time elapses. So if it's been, 2 years since you acquired the data and you need to go back to the data provider and ask about a particular variable or ask how a specific index was constructed, it's possible that the person who is working on that might have moved on, or it may be difficult to be in touch. So if you're able to ask and have all of those clarifying questions answered at the time of acquisition, it's going to always be more successful. Of course, you may not know all of the questions that come up, but trying to do a really careful scrutiny of the data and understand it very well is essential. And depending on the data provider, right, these files may come in a very organized format that already is cleaned up and it's just a data set with a data dictionary and code book, and it's very, very easy to use. Or it may be a whole range of, say, different spreadsheets coming from an administrative data system with lots of different pages of reports and manuals for how those were generated. That's going to take more cleaning up. So what the data looked like coming in will vary, but in our experience, it's almost always messier than you expect and important to spend some time organizing and cleaning up. Okay, so that's the first section of this chapter, which is just covering establishing your usage rights and access to development data. And that, again, applies to all types of data that might be required. Now, for those teams that are working with primary data specifically, we dive into significantly more detail in the workflow for collecting high quality data using electronic surveys and all of the what are all of the steps in a successful primary data acquisition, and how do you maintain quality along the way in each of those steps. So before I dive into the details, a few questions again to understand, what is the nature of of our audience here? What's the experience? So the first question is, have you designed, managed, or otherwise participated in a survey that uses electronic data collection? And I'll give you 30 seconds or so to respond here. And again, just a note, I see some hands raised. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and the team will be able to answer those questions as the presentation goes along, or I'll have 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the session to go through all of the questions that remain there. So please do use the Q&A feature. Just a few more seconds here, but it looks like most people have somehow participated in a survey. So that's great, and I think this section will be very relevant then. As we dive into the details, I'm going to close this poll now and go on to the next one, which is an open-ended question. And I'm curious what you all think are the most important ways to ensure high quality data for an electronic survey. You may have some ideas of this for the reading that's already happened this week, and we'll talk. I'll talk a lot more about this in the remainder of the lecture, but I want to have your initial thoughts, and please do limit your responses to 1 or 2 words as we're doing this kind of in a word cloud format. Feel free to put in multiple responses, but each response should be quite short. So I see piloting, piloting and pre-testing, which are all related, and I definitely agree are essential. The enumerator training, questionnaire design, supervision, fact checks, the platform for data collection. It's an interesting one that can certainly matter. Tools that are being used, enumerator training, spot checks, using hints, definitely. Great, so lots of different ideas here, and ideas that are coming in across all of the stages of the workflow, which is again the focus that we have in this handbook, is thinking at every stage of the workflow, how do you ensure quality of the data that will ultimately be generated from this process. All right, wonderful to see all these responses. I'm going to close this now and go into the lecture for this section. Okay, so first here is just thinking about what are the stages of the survey workflow that are relevant, and we break this down into 7 different stages in our description in the chapter. So the first is drafting the questionnaire, which we recommend doing on paper, reasons I'll discuss. Then piloting it with a focus on the content and refining the content of that questionnaire. Then once the content is fully developed, programming it for electronic data collection using whatever software you've chosen for your project. Then doing another pilot that's focused on the data, having a practice round to export that data, make sure it's all where everything in the technology is working as expected and that the data looks in the format you expect. Then training the enumerators and starting data collection. Then conducting field validation, so field quality checks while data is ongoing. And finally, running data quality checks from the office side, so on the back end, looking at the data as it's coming in. And I'll talk about each of these stages in more detail, but the sequencing also matters. And I think that's something that we focus on a lot, that we think it's important to put a lot of energy and time into the questionnaire development before you start programming, to do all of the programming and testing of the instrument before you start training enumerators, and to have everything really well established before data collection starts. And then once data collection starts, put a lot of time and energy into both those field and data quality checks. So I'll talk about each of these stages in a little bit more detail. The first one is designing electronic survey instruments. So the first point that I want to make, and one we emphasize a lot in the book, is the importance of designing surveys on paper, even when you're planning for electronic data collection. And so the question is, why would we recommend that? Why does that make sense? Well, first, because it helps to ensure that research questions drive the design of your survey instrument. You're not constrained by technology, but you're really thinking about, okay, ideally, how would we collect this information? How do we break that down into questions? And what is the information that we want to have in order to answer our research questions? And then As you go ahead and pilot those and understand what will work in your particular context, you're able to make substantial revisions, both to the flow and the structure and the overall sequencing of questions without needing to do substantial reprogramming, right? It's much easier to make big edits to a questionnaire on paper, really shuffle things around without causing kind of programming bugs or issues with the survey logic, any of that. Obviously, those, will all need to be ultimately finalized. But it provides more flexibility. And we think it's really important for teams to feel unconstrained in the piloting process about revisions, because oftentimes substantial revisions are needed to go from, an initial idea to an actual fieldable questionnaire. And in the last reason that we have is also that, an easy to read paper questionnaire is actually really important to have for training and for data documentation. And it's not always straightforward to generate an easy to read printable version of a questionnaire from survey software. That's something that's improving a little bit over time, but it still is a constraint. So having these two versions developed in parallel does make sense, even though it's can be somewhat challenging in terms of the version control once you do start programming. But that's why getting as final a product as possible before you start programming helps. Now, thinking about how to draft your survey instruments, we really think about this in the same way we talked about pseudocode in other parts of the books, which is kind of starting from the biggest picture possible, where you list what your key outcomes are for the research study and your covariates of interest based on the pre-analysis plan that you've put together or the theory of change for the project. And then from that, creating an outline of the different modules you'll need in the questionnaire, noting for each module, the respondent and the relevance. Like, will it apply to all types of respondents? Will the respondent for all modules be the same? And then once you have that kind of overall outline structure, populating each of the modules. And again, we recommend using questions from established surveys as much as possible. So don't start from scratch if you don't need to. If other people have had the same interests and questions, and they've successfully fielded surveys using those, it's best to take those examples rather than writing your own, as long as they're appropriate and applied. Of course, you'll need to modify things to your context, but working from established survey instruments rather than from scratch is always best practice. Now, once you have a survey instrument designed, then it's time to pilot and test those out. And we think of a comprehensive survey pilot having 3 phases. The first is the pre-pilot, which is something that's done very early on in the process of questionnaire design. And it's your opportunity to gather qualitative information related to the key outcomes that you care about. So this is especially important if you're working in a context that you're not familiar with, or a sector that the research team hasn't necessarily explored before. And you really just want to get more familiar with what these outcomes look like in your context and how you'll need to think about measurement. That can help to inform even the very basics of the questionnaire design. Then once you have your paper version of your survey pretty much fully developed, you want to do a content-focused pilot. So that's when you're thinking about the structure and the length, the flow of the interview. Does it make sense? Does the respondent seem comfortable? Are any new questions that you drafted specifically for this questionnaire making sense? Do respondents understand? Are the answers that you're providing comprehensive? And do the survey protocols make sense? Do your protocols for who will be the target respondent work in practice? Are there any issues with talking to different members of the household? So thinking through all of those issues, then doing any substantial revisions that might be needed. You may need to do multiple days of piloting, of content-focused piloting. That's typically true. And then the last step is the data-focused pilot. And as I said in the workflow, this comes after you've actually programmed the questionnaire. So content-focused pilot, finalize your survey instrument, program the questionnaire, and then do a data-focused pilot. And then the focus of this pilot is much less on, content and refining that, but thinking about, is the technology working, right? So is the programming itself working? Are you getting the right survey logic? Are you getting the right flow of questions that you expected? And then being able to export and scrutinize the data, making sure that it's in the format that you anticipated, and also looking into interview duration, because that's going to matter quite a lot, and it's often hard to assess until you have the final programmed instrument. All right. And one thing we talk about in the book is that, the advantage of doing an electronic survey, the advantages of using electronic questionnaires and survey instruments are many, but some of those are around data quality, right? And that there's a lot of ways to use technology to your advantage to ensure that the data that you're getting out of your survey is highest quality. So we, note a few here, things like the opportunity to automatically incorporate multiple languages, to program in survey logic so you're not relying on enumerators to understand and remember the different skip codes or relevances, putting in range checks and pop-up errors that come up if you do have outliers. So using technology to your advantage throughout the programming, it can be very, very helpful for data quality. And another best practice we talk about here is thinking about how your variable names and variables and values are named and labeled within your survey instrument. That's going to matter to how the data export looks, and also to how easy it is for other people to interact with your survey instrument after the fact. So kind of as your documentation for this data collection, you want those to be as self-explanatory as possible. Okay, then moving on to training enumerators. So again, we talk about best practices here. There's three that I want to emphasize. The first is developing a detailed enumerator manual. This is going to serve as the basis for the training, but it's really important to do as you're going through this whole process of questionnaire development, noting, and particularly the pilot, right, is noting any specific considerations for questions, explaining in detail to the enumerators what you're trying to assess and measure, and any areas that do come up as confusing during the pilot can be clarified here. Then in the training itself, including a lot of objective assessments. So for example, pop quizzes in the mornings or scored interviews throughout the days. This is trying to give you the best information possible to select your top performers. Typically, you want to train more enumerators than you'll actually employ. And then finally, having enough time for the training. And typically, with the type of complex survey instruments that we are often talking about in the context of development research, you typically will need at least 1 to 2 weeks for data collection. For data collection, for training. And it could be longer than that, depending on the complexity and the scope. But it would be really, I think, quite rare to have to dedicate less than a week to training for a typical research survey. And the training itself should focus on 3 components. So first is reviewing that paper questionnaire, so that enumerators really understand, what is the content of what we're trying to ask and the structure. It can be hard to get a sense of the overall design and structure of a questionnaire from a tablet when you're going question by question. And then to review the electronic survey instrument, make sure that all the enumerators are really comfortable with the software that you've chosen, and they understand how to interact with the electronic survey instrument, what to anticipate in terms of the quality checks and, for example, range, consistency checks, any of that might be showing up there. And finally, of course, field practice, where we need actual practice interviews and enumerators submitting data for review and feedback. And I think a common confusion here that we emphasize is that this field practice should not be considered the same as piloting. That by the time you're at the field practice in an enumerator training, your survey instrument should be final. There may be some small issues that need to be resolved as a result of the piloting, but you should not be making substantial changes, and you should not consider this the opportunity to pilot. This is just a chance for enumerators to get some practical experience and to understand how to submit the data and to get some individualized feedback on the data that they do submit. All right, so once data collection starts, the enumerators are all trained, you start data collection, then the focus is on how to assure data quality. And there's 2 sides of that. One is the data checks, and the other is the field checks themselves. So data checks we often refer to as high frequency checks, or HFCs. And that's by that we mean a scripted set of data checks that will run every day data is collected. So these are things that you think about in advance of the survey starting, and you run them all the time on every batch of data that's coming in. The types of checks you might want to include here are going to include things like monitoring consistency and range of responses, validating the survey programming, making sure that all of the modules are actually showing up. There's no unexpected missing data. Testing for enumerator specific effects. Are certain enumerators having much longer duration of surveys or much shorter? Are they systematically skipping any information? And also checking for duplicate entries and completeness vis-a-vis the field logs. That's all on the data side. It's equally important to be doing field checks in so much as possible, which most recently with the pandemic has been obviously more complicated, but still possible in some ways. So there's 3 different types of field checks that we think of being important here. The first is back checks, where you have a separate team that revisits a subset of the respondents to validate key responses, ensure that they were interviewed, and then ensure that the correct data points were collected. Spot checks, which are where field supervisors or even members of the research team, if appropriate in context, make unannounced field visits to enumerators to ensure that they're following the protocols. And finally, audio audits, which we found to be especially useful in the context of remote supervision, which has had to happen more often in the past year and a half, which is where portions of the interviews are actually recorded so that someone can listen and make sure that the appropriate data is being recorded and protocols are being followed. Now, of course, those require an additional level of informed consent from respondents, but they can be quite a useful tool. But I think the point I really want to emphasize with all of these checks, right, is that they improve your data quality only if the issues that you catch in those are communicated to the field team in a timely fashion and corrections are documented and applied. So doing these in real time is critical, and communicating the outcomes of these checks in real time is essential to actually having them matter, right? So doing back checks and then only looking at the data after the survey is already complete is not going to make a big impact. But really focusing, especially in the first weeks of data collection, on providing a lot of feedback to enumerators about issues that are coming up, noting if there's any problems with the survey instrument and making those changes as required, but making sure that that's all being communicated very clearly, both because it helps people not to learn bad habits, but also because there's opportunities then to go back to the field as needed, or to make significant changes to protocols or to even the field team if there seems to be issues with particular people. Okay, so that is the summary of section 2, which is all around high quality data through electronic surveys. And now let's shift to section 3. Handling data securely. And as with the other 2, I have some questions to start off with to understand, what your own experiences are in this domain. So first, have you ever encrypted any development data? So with any of the projects that you're working on, have you used encryption in any way? So the answers here are a few. It could be that you've encrypted files that are stored on your own computer, or you've used encryption to protect files stored on a cloud server. You've encrypted files before transferring them to partner organizations, or no, that you haven't ever used any type of encryption, or that you don't even know what encryption means. And I guess I would hope we don't see too many people answering E, because we do talk about this a bit in the book, and I hope that you'll have read it by now, but totally understand if not. I know people have different workflows and timing for the readings of these each week. But if you are not familiar with encryption, then definitely do read those sections in section 3 of chapter 4. It looks like most of you have not ever used encryption. So this is something that, again, I'll talk about kind of the basics and principles of here, but we dive into more detail in the handbook, and then we have lots more detail available through the links that are provided there. For example, we link to our GitHub repository, where we have the specific kind of implementation details that we use within DIME that we're happy to share. And also our DIME Wiki articles have a lot of details on how to implement. So I'll give you the high level points. The chapter will give you a good background on why this is important, and then the links to follow there will give you a lot of details about how to do this in practice. Okay, another few seconds here for any last answers. All right, I'm going to close this poll and move to the next one. I guess the next one comes later. So let me jump in now. So as we saw here, most people have not used encryption or don't even know what encryption means. So let me spend a little bit of time now explaining, what this is in basics and why it's important. So first, what is encryption actually doing? So it's making your data files totally unusable to anybody who doesn't have the decryption key. And so to that end, encryption keys must be stored and shared very carefully. But essentially, it's a way to protect your data by ensuring that only specific authorized users who have the key have access to that data. And it will be just kind of a jumble of information to anybody else. It's important to use encryption in two contexts. First is encryption in transit, which is protecting any data that gets sent over the internet. For example, from a tablet to the cloud platform in electronic data collection. This is one that rarely needs to be implemented by the project team itself. So in fact, I'm sure almost everyone has in fact used encrypted data just in practice of working with surveys, as you've been mentioning. Data is almost always encrypted in transit, just as a built-in feature of modern survey software like Survey CTO or Survey Solutions or Qualtrics. But then there's also encryption at rest, right? And that's one that is more often needs to be manually implemented by the research team. And so encryption at rest, it means protecting the data when it's being stored. So that could be on a server or could be on a local computer or drive. And oftentimes it's both of those things for data that's being collected electronically. Yeah. Okay. And well, just another note here, I would say, is why is this important, right? Encryption is a really good tool to protect data that's sensitive for any reason, right? And the most common reason for data to be sensitive is that it contains personally identifying information. And when we collect data in the field and do in the informed consent modules, we're almost always telling respondents that their data will be handled carefully and that the identifying details that they share will not be shared outside of the research team. In order to actually make that happen in practice, encryption is our best tool, so that information is not shared more broadly and there isn't access to personal information from outside of the research team. So thinking about how to implement safe data collection and storage, it's going to vary a little bit with whether you're using primary data or secondary data. So with primary data, for example, that you're collecting through electronic surveys. As I said in the previous slide, most survey software automatically encrypt the data when it's coming from the tablets to the cloud platform. But typically, users need to enable encryption at rest so that data is actually stored on the server. It may not be protected automatically. Typically, is not protected automatically, and that needs to be enabled by the users. And you also need to think about always encrypting those files when transferring them outside of the survey software. So, for example, if you're downloading them or sharing, any information with any personally identifying information outside of that software, like sending sample lists directly to a survey team. In the case of secondary data, we want to think about, it's particularly important to think about how the data is being transferred. So if you're acquiring data from a partner organization, you want that data to be protected when it's transferred to you, so that it's transferred in a secure method. And typically that means encrypting the file or providing an encrypted mechanism for receiving that data. And so that, for example, there's two forms there, right? As I mentioned, you can encrypt the file yourself, or the partner organization can encrypt it themselves and then transfer it to you by any means, or can upload the data to a shared folder using some secure software approved by your institution. And what software will work is going to depend on the context. And now the other point that we make about handling data safely in this section of chapter 4 is the importance of backing up any original data that you're receiving. So this is critical for data that's generated specifically for the research project, like through surveys, or data that you're receiving from a partner organization that's, again, not publicly available. It's going to be less important if it's data that you could just go back and download again, but still a good idea to have a solid backup protocol. So in this case, we think of the best practice being a 3-2-1 rule, where you have a working copy of the data, which is, in order to have that, you're going to create a folder on your local computer, encrypt it, and download your original data to it. Then you'll have a master backup copy, which is the second folder on an external drive with that original data copied to it and stored in a secure location. And now if that's stored somewhere safe, like for example, locked into a safe, it doesn't necessarily need to be encrypted. And that can be a way to prevent any data loss if for some reason the encryption keys are lost. And the third is what we call a golden master backup copy, which is a third folder created using cloud storage, a second computer, or hard drive in another location that's encrypted and then has that original data copied to it. So that may seem like a lot, but it's pretty important to make sure you don't ever lose data. And if all goes well, you should never actually need to access either the master backup or the golden master backup copy of the data. You should be able to just work with that working copy. But there's always circumstances in which computers crash or files are lost, and it's important to be able to have that backup to refer to if needed. Okay, and so now I have the question, our last poll here, which is, are the data sets for your research backed up? So, the answers vary from yes in multiple locations. For example, following that 3-2-1 rule. Yes, I have at least one backup, which is still much better than none. No, and I'm not sure or not applicable if you're not actually working with any data at this point. No, I'll give another 30 seconds or so here for people to vote. But it looks like the majority have one backup. So again, that's great. That's definitely better than not having any data backups, but we would encourage you to follow that 3-2-1 rule. So you can read up more in the chapter about what that means. And again, we link to some specific guidelines for implementation that you can follow. It's the safest strategy to follow. And for those of you who don't have any backups of the data, I would really, really encourage you to back it up somewhere. And ideally, again, follow that 3-2-1 strategy. The worst thing is to be partway through a research project and then have a laptop get stolen or a computer crash or data, somehow some issue with data getting deleted by accident, right? And then not have a backup copy to refer to, especially if, for example, that data was generated by surveys and you don't have any way of reacquiring it without going back to the field. Okay, I'm going to close the poll here. And just a few final notes from this chapter. So as with all the chapters, we talk a little bit about how these tasks can be divided across a research team and what's primarily in the domain of the principal investigator and what's primarily in the domain of the research assistant. So the principal investigator, we think of having important roles in terms of obtaining legal documentation and permission agreements for all of the data. So that's that first section. In the second section on surveys, they're typically going to be responsible for supervising development of all instruments and protocols, reviewing and providing inputs to the data quality assurance plan, and providing guidance on any issues that do come up during data quality checks. And typically, in terms of handling data security, that the PI is going to be the one to establish and supervise the implementation of the security and backup protocols. So that may be something where there's institutional standards for what these are, and there's not a lot of decisions needed, or it may be something where there's quite a lot of individual idiosyncrasies. Now, the research assistant, on the other hand, when it comes to data acquisition, is responsible for coordinating with the data providers and preparing and archiving all of the documentation for the data. And for surveys, typically is responsible for developing and programming the survey instruments under the guidance of the PI, coordinating the survey pilots, reporting back on those, and supporting the development of all the enumerator manual, and drafting the data quality assurance plan and managing quality checks. And in terms of handling data securely, the role here is to implement those security data backup protocols, make sure that they are actually being followed. And again, as with other chapters, we have a bunch of application questions to think about how you might apply what you're learning in this chapter to your own project. There's a handout on those that you all have access to. I've highlighted a few here, but for each section, we encourage you to think about what does this mean in the context of your own research. So if you're thinking about data ownership, electronic data collection, or data security, I encourage you to go through those questions, think about what applies, what you've already done, what you might want to do, what you might want to change. And of course, reach out to us with any questions about how you can put any of this guidance into practice. So with that, I will close the lecture portion of this and move on to the Q&A. I see that there are a few questions here, and I'd encourage you very much to add more as we go along. I see the team's already answered a bunch, and I do have a question as well as to whether we can share the Q&A later. And I think that's a great question. We can certainly think about the best way to do it. We've been really impressed by the caliber of the questions that come up in these lecture sessions, and happy to share those either. You can obviously see the answers to some of them as if you're here in the WebEx in the Zoom webinar, but we'll think about a way to make those accessible to everyone and have a permanent archive. Okay, so I have a question from Victor here. During the book launch, Arianna Legovini mentioned that our capability in solving problems is determined by our understanding of those problems. Our understanding of problems would therefore depend on the quality and credibility of data collected, whereas in some cases, what was perceived to be responsible for a problem may not be the root cause of that problem. How do we design survey instruments to make room for unexpected causes of the problems that we are addressing? That's an interesting question for sure. I think that my first response to that would be that it's really important to do good kind of qualitative research around the design of a research project, right? And understanding the context really well, and the nature of the problem that you're trying to answer in your context. And if we have a good, solid understanding of the context and the research questions are well rooted, then designing the survey instruments is going to follow naturally from that survey design. Now that said, another way in which this can be addressed, which is in some ways similar, is in piloting your survey instruments, right? And making sure that the questions that you are asking in your survey really get at the root problems that you want to understand, as in the nature of the, for the problem that your research is trying to address. And so I really can't overemphasize the importance of a comprehensive survey pilot. And again, that usually involves both a pre-pilot that's really just qualitative conversations, focus groups, talking to people about the problems that you're interested in, and thinking about how to then translate those into some quantitative survey questions, but also testing your survey questions and making sure that they're really getting at what you want to get before you jump into the data collection. Now, that said, I think the last piece of this is that, we think of research and impact evaluations at time as being a very iterative process, right? And so scrutinizing the data as it comes in, working on data analysis promptly after the completion of data collection, sharing those results with with partners and colleagues and puzzling through them. And if things look really different than you anticipated, thinking about if there's things that you need to change in a data collection round going forward. Usually we have a few different rounds of data collection within the life cycle of a project. So thinking about whether there's things that need to be changed in the data collection process, or thinking about whether revisions are needed to the research questions themselves and the questions that you're trying to answer. Okay, another question here from Andy. What is the average minimum timeline to train enumerators for survey research? It's very hard to come up with a meaningful average here because it's going to depend on both the length and the complexity of the survey instrument on which you're training and the associated protocols for those survey instruments. I would say, we can certainly think in terms of a minimum bound, where there are very, very few survey instruments I can think of where less than a week of training would be appropriate. With a typical kind of multi-module questionnaire that we do for a lot of the research we do at DIME, usually around 2 weeks, I would say is an average for training, but longer in the case where we're trying to do something, unusually complex, or there might be, for example, if we're doing a survey with a hard to reach population, like refugees or at-risk youth, then there might need to be a lot more time dedicated to the survey protocols than just the survey instrument itself. Okay. We have a question about audio audits. So that's a feature of a lot of modern survey software is the ability to randomly record portions of an interview. That can be, 5 minutes here and there, or it could even be the full interview, to make an audio file that is saved at the same time that the data is submitted to the cloud, so that somebody else, for example, an independent auditor can listen to those excerpts of the interview or to the full interview and review both the data that was entered to make sure that it aligns with what the respondent was saying, but also how well the enumerator followed the different protocols for the survey. So in terms of both how they were interacting with the respondent, but also were they, going through the questions in the type of detail and sequencing that's expected. Collecting data with Survey CTO or Survey Solutions, what way is best, since with Survey Solutions, we don't need an HFC code. So I would say, it really, it's going to, again, depend on the team, what they prefer. Survey CTO and Survey Solutions are two examples of survey software. There are a lot of other ones out there as well. I think of, within DIME, we have most often used Survey CTO, but a lot of World Bank teams use Survey Solutions, and we have some experience with that as well. I think of those two as being very comparable. There are other survey software out there that probably have similar features as well. I just have less personal experience with using those. But between Survey CTO and Survey Solutions, I think it's really just going to be a matter of the preferences within the team and what they're already familiar with, and the workflows that they're most comfortable with. The question around, HFC codes, I think that really, depends on how you're interacting with data. It's possible to put checks into both software to do that within the survey platform itself. In our experience at DIME, teams tend to be more comfortable with exporting the data and running those checks through R or Stata. But that's really just a matter of preference and workflows. And as long as you're able to run all the checks that you want to be able to do with the data, the platform for doing so really doesn't matter. It's just having those checks pre-thought out and running them on a frequent basis in whatever platform is going to be the most important for the data quality itself. Okay. Please, so an anonymous point here. Yep, consider sharing the Q&A. The materials on OSF are awesome, but the in-class questions and your responses to these questions are useful in helping us to understand the material better. No, that's a great point. It's not one that we'd really thought about. So we'll certainly figure out the best way to do that and update, especially those I think that get answered as the presentations are running, because these questions that I'm answering in person will be in the recordings of the webinars themselves that are going to be available permanently. Okay, we have a question from Janet about where can I get high frequency SPSS or STATA codes. I'd be very interested in running them. We have a lot of details on our wiki articles about the type of high frequency checks that get run, and we link to the case study that we use in our book, the Demand for Safe Spaces project. We link to the some of the code for those, so you can see examples there and details. But the exact high frequency checks that you will run for your particular project are going to depend entirely on the variables included in the survey. So there really isn't, we can talk generically about what types of checks should be there, and we do that in the wiki article. But the how to code those up specifically will depend on, just what are the variable names in your survey, and what are the expected ranges or values or consistencies within your particular context or survey instrument. So I'd encourage you to check out the resources that we do have, but we can provide examples of code that has been run, but there is no kind of, just plug and play for high frequency checks. They do have to be highly adapted to a particular survey instrument. Okay, I don't see anything else coming up in the chat at the moment. No open questions. We do have a few more minutes, so I'd certainly encourage anybody else to put in questions, and maybe just turn it over to the other authors who are here. Was there any questions that came up while I've not looked at the questions that were answered while I was presenting? Is there anything that you answered that you think would be worth highlighting, especially for the audience on YouTube that might not have seen the answers coming up? All right, I don't hear anything from anybody, so I'm going to guess that means not too much. And again, just a reminder here of some of the logistics for the course. So you have the links to all of the chapter 4 materials. So there's this lecture, there's the overview video, the list of assigned readings, the list of application questions, and the quiz. We hope you go through all of those. Again, there is no specific deadline, but if you're able to go through those close to this week, then that's optimal. And please do put any other questions that might come up in Slack, so that we're able to answer those. And again, others are able to see them. And I see Avnish is posting the list, those links in the chat here. And he posted them all in Slack earlier this morning as well. Okay, we've got a couple of more questions in, so I'll answer those before we close. The first from Macquarie: how do we ensure that ethical research conduct is fully adhered to in the data quality process? So I think a few key principles for ethics in data collection are, first, informed consent. So making sure that before you start interviewing anyone, they understand what the purpose is of the interview, how the data that they provide will be used, and who will have access to that data, and how long their information will be retained. And then they have the opportunity, a meaningful opportunity, to say yes or no to participation. So that's critical. And that's respected, of course, by the enumerators is critical. But then it's also really important that the research team does everything that they can to ensure that those conditions that are explained in the informed consent statement are actually met, right? So if it's said that, your data will only be shared with members of the research team, that the data is carefully handled and protected such that it's not more broadly accessible. And if someone declines to participate, that decision is respected going forward. So those, I think, are the most important. Of course, respectful treatment in general by enumerators of the survey respondents is very important. And then trying not to take too much time. So trying to make sure that survey instruments are well designed to capture all the information that's required, but no more, is again important. And with the follow-ups that are done, like back checks, making sure that those are quick and efficient, and really just focused on ensuring that the respondents had a good experience during the interview. Okay. I'd say, oh, okay, one last question and then we'll close. Are there ever situations where respondents withdraw their consent later in the study, such that these observations are dropped from the data set? Yes. So what, exactly how this will be handled will depend on the institutional context. From our side, I can say within the bank, that there is opportunity for people to revoke consent throughout the life cycle of a research study. So that's certainly possible, but it's going to depend whether that applies. It's going to depend on the specific protocols that you set up and the ethics requirements from your institution. And how do you ensure clarity of survey questions without losing the meaning of the question? That's what we do with all of the piloting and testing, is making sure that the questions make sense to the respondent and that the data it makes sense coming in as well. Okay, with that, I think we're out of time. So we will close for today. But thank you all very much for the great questions. And again, any questions we didn't get to here, feel free to make in Slack. Our whole team monitors those channels, and we're all happy to answer any questions that do come up, whether they're logistical about how the course is running, or actually technical in terms of the course material. Happy to go into any of those. So thank you all, and look forward to interacting with you more over the remainder of the course.